What if the modern car was built around a flawed idea from the very beginning? For more than a century, the automotive industry has followed one unquestioned rule. The engine burns fuel, creates power, and drives the wheels. It's not just how cars work, it's how we believe they have to work. But that belief hides a contradiction. Because internal combustion engines, despite over 100 years of refinement, are only efficient under very specific, stable conditions. A narrow range of speed, a controlled load, a predictable environment. And driving is none of those things. It's chaotic, constantly changing, inherently unstable. So instead of fixing that mismatch, the industry adapted around it. Gearboxes to chase efficiency, complex transmissions to manage variability, hybrid systems to compensate for losses. Layer after layer, built on top of the same assumption, that the engine must directly power the car. But what if that assumption is the real limitation? What if the engine was never meant to respond to the road at all? Because a different architecture is beginning to emerge, one that separates energy generation from motion entirely. An engine that doesn't drive the wheels, doesn't react to throttle, doesn't even behave like a traditional engine anymore. And strangely, that might make it more efficient than ever before. So the real question is no longer how to improve the engine. It's whether we've been using it wrong all along. And today, we're going to understand why. To understand why this idea is so deeply embedded in the automotive world, you have to go back to the beginning. At the birth of the automobile, the internal combustion engine wasn't chosen because it was perfect. It was chosen because it was practical. Early electric vehicles already existed in the late 19th century. They were quiet, smooth, and surprisingly refined. But they had one critical limitation: energy storage. Batteries were heavy, inefficient, and painfully limited in range. Fuel, on the other hand, was dense, portable, easy to store, and the internal combustion engine offered a simple promise: convert that fuel into motion. So the architecture became obvious. Burn fuel, create mechanical rotation, send that rotation directly to the wheels. No layers, no abstraction, just a physical link between combustion and movement. And for a while, it worked. But there was a problem hiding beneath that simplicity. Because an internal combustion engine doesn't behave like a linear machine. It behaves more like a living system, sensitive, temperamental, dependent on precise conditions. Its efficiency isn't constant. It peaks only at specific combinations of speed and load. Too slow, and it wastes energy. Too fast, and friction takes over. Too much load, and it struggles. Too little, and it becomes inefficient. But driving doesn't care about any of that. Drivers accelerate unpredictably. Roads change constantly. Traffic introduces chaos into what should be a controlled system. And suddenly, the engine is forced to operate far outside its optimal range, most of the time. So engineers did what engineers always do. They adapted. Gearboxes were introduced to keep the engine closer to its efficient operating window. More gears meant finer control. Automatic transmissions added another layer of optimization. And over time, these systems became incredibly sophisticated, almost architectural in their complexity. But they were never solving the root problem. They were managing it, trying to align an inherently unstable demand with a system that only works best under stability. And then came hybrids, a new layer in the same philosophy. Use electric motors to fill the gaps, smooth out inefficiencies, recover lost energy. But even then, the core assumption remained untouched. The engine still had to respond to the road, still had to adapt to the driver, still had to drive the wheels. And this is where the story becomes interesting, because once you question that single assumption, the entire architecture of the car begins to look different, not just improved, but fundamentally reimagined. This is where the real problem begins to reveal itself. Because at its core, an internal combustion engine is not a flexible machine. It's a machine that prefers consistency. And more importantly, it has an efficiency map, a very specific one. If you were to plot its fuel consumption against engine speed and load, you wouldn't get a flat surface. You'd get a narrow island, a small region where the engine operates at peak efficiency. Outside of that island, everything starts to fall apart. Fuel consumption rises. Energy is wasted as heat. Mechanical losses increase. And here's the uncomfortable truth. In real-world driving, the engine almost never stays inside that optimal zone. Because driving is not a controlled experiment. It's a constantly shifting demand for power. When a car accelerates, the engine is suddenly pushed into higher load conditions. When cruising, it drops into partial load, often far from its efficient range. In traffic, it fluctuates unpredictably. So instead of operating like a finely tuned energy converter, the engine becomes reactive, always chasing demand, rarely operating where it wants to be. And that mismatch creates a fundamental inefficiency. Now, the industry has known this for decades, so the solution seemed straightforward. If the engine can't adapt perfectly, then the system around it should. This is where the gearbox comes in. At first, it was simple. A few fixed ratios to keep the engine within a usable range. But as expectations grew, performance, efficiency, comfort, gearboxes became more complex. 5 gears, 6, 8, 10. Each additional ratio attempting to keep the engine closer to its optimal efficiency island. But there's a trade-off. More gears mean more components, more friction, more weight, more control complexity. And even with all that, the system is still reactive, still adjusting after the fact, still trying to keep up with a constantly changing demand. Automatic transmissions pushed this even further, using hydraulics, electronics, and software to constantly shift ratios in real time. But underneath all that sophistication, the same limitation remained. The engine still had to follow the road. Then came hybrid systems. And for a moment, it looked like the industry had found a breakthrough. Electric motors could assist during acceleration, recover energy during braking, reduce load on the engine. It was a clever solution, but not a fundamental one. Because in most hybrid architectures, the engine is still mechanically linked to the wheels, still required to respond to driving conditions, still trapped in the same reactive loop. So what you end up with is not a clean solution, but a layered one. An engine trying to operate efficiently, a gearbox trying to manage its range, an electric motor trying to compensate for both. 3 systems, solving the same problem from different angles, and with every layer, the system becomes more complex, more expensive, harder to optimize, harder to scale. And this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because the industry has spent decades refining ways to manage the engine's limitations without ever questioning why those limitations exist in the first place. Why must the engine constantly adapt? Why must it respond to every fluctuation in demand? Why must it directly drive the wheels at all? Because once you ask those questions, you arrive at a very different possibility. One where the engine is no longer part of the drivetrain, no longer reactive, no longer forced out of its optimal state. And this is where everything begins to change. The moment you remove a single assumption, everything starts to reorganize. What if the engine didn't have to follow the wheels? What if it didn't need to respond to acceleration, deceleration, or changing terrain? What if its only job was to generate energy? This is the idea behind a completely different architecture, a series hybrid system. In this setup, the engine is no longer connected to the drivetrain. There is no direct mechanical link to the wheels. Instead, the engine is coupled to a generator. Its sole purpose is to produce electricity. That electricity is either sent directly to an electric motor or stored temporarily in a battery. And the motor, not the engine, is what drives the wheels. At first glance, it sounds like an unnecessary extra step. Fuel, to engine, to electricity, back to motion. More conversions, more losses, more complexity. But this is where the logic flips, because now the engine is no longer reacting to the road. It's operating in isolation, and that changes everything. Instead of constantly shifting across a wide range of speeds and loads, the engine can be locked into its most efficient operating point. A fixed RPM, a stable load, a controlled environment, right in the center of that efficiency island, where fuel consumption is minimized and energy conversion is optimized. It no longer needs a gearbox, no multi-speed transmission, no constant adjustment, just steady, continuous operation. Meanwhile, the electric motor takes over the role the engine was never good at. Instant torque, precise control, full efficiency across a wide range of speeds. Acceleration becomes smooth and immediate. Energy that would normally be lost during braking is recovered. And most importantly, the system is no longer fighting itself. Energy generation and motion delivery are separated, decoupled, optimized independently. This is not just a different configuration, it's a different philosophy. Instead of forcing one machine to do everything, each component is assigned the role it performs best. The engine becomes a dedicated power plant. The motor becomes the sole source of motion, and the battery becomes a buffer, absorbing fluctuations, smoothing demand, stabilizing the entire system. Suddenly, the chaos of driving no longer directly affects the engine. Traffic, terrain, acceleration, all of it is handled electrically. The engine remains calm, constant, efficient. And this is where the numbers start to become interesting. Because by operating within its optimal efficiency zone for extended periods, the engine can achieve significantly better real-world fuel efficiency than in a traditional setup. Not because the engine itself has changed, but because the way it's used has. And this is the shift the industry is beginning to explore. Not improving the engine, not refining the gearbox, but redefining the relationship between them. Because once the engine is freed from the drivetrain, it stops behaving like a compromise and starts behaving like a solution. But not everyone in the industry agrees on this direction. Because while this architecture solves one set of problems, it challenges everything the industry has been building toward. Take traditional hybrids. Companies like Toyota have spent decades refining parallel hybrid systems where the engine and electric motor both contribute to driving the wheels. It's a carefully balanced compromise. Efficient, reliable, proven at scale. But it still depends on one assumption. The engine must remain part of the drivetrain. Then there are fully electric vehicles. Led by companies like Tesla, the industry has begun moving toward removing the engine entirely. No fuel, no combustion, no complexity, just batteries and motors. It's the cleanest solution, at least in theory. But it comes with its own limitations. Charging infrastructure, battery cost, range under real-world conditions. And this is where series hybrids occupy a strange middle ground. Companies like Nissan, with systems like e-Power, have already begun exploring this architecture in production vehicles. The engine never drives the wheels. It only generates electricity, a concept that feels closer to an electric car, but without depending entirely on batteries. So the question becomes harder to ignore. Is the future fully electric? Or is it a transitional architecture where combustion still exists, but no longer behaves the way we expect? Because if separating energy generation from motion truly improves efficiency, then the industry may not just be evolving, it may be reorganizing itself around a completely different idea. For over a century, the automobile has been defined by a simple relationship. An engine produces power, and that power drives the wheels. It's a model so deeply ingrained that it feels almost inevitable. But, as we've seen, inevitability doesn't always mean correctness, because the internal combustion engine was never a perfect match for the chaos of real-world driving. It was a compromise, a powerful one, a scalable one, but still a compromise. And now, for the first time, that compromise is being questioned at a fundamental level, not by improving the engine, not by adding more gears, not by layering more complexity, but by asking a simpler question. What if the engine was never meant to drive the car at all? What if its role was always supposed to be something else? A generator, a stabilizer, a background system, rather than the center of motion. If that idea continues to prove itself, then the future of the automobile may not be defined by better engines, but by how we choose to use them. Because sometimes the biggest breakthrough isn't a new technology. It's realizing that the old one was being used the wrong way. For over a century, the automobile has been defined by a simple relationship. An engine produces power, and that power drives the wheels. It's a model so deeply ingrained that it feels almost inevitable. But as we've seen, inevitability doesn't always mean correctness. Because the internal combustion engine was never a perfect match for the chaos of real-world driving. It was a compromise, a powerful one, a scalable one, but still a compromise. And now, for the first time, that compromise is being questioned at a fundamental level. Not by improving the engine, not by adding more gears, not by layering more complexity, but by asking a simpler question. What if the engine was never meant to drive the car at all? What if its role was always supposed to be something else? A generator, a stabilizer, a background system, rather than the center of motion. If that idea continues to prove itself, then the future of the automobile may not be defined by better engines, but by how we choose to use them. Because sometimes the biggest breakthrough isn't a new technology. It's realizing that the old one was being used the wrong way